All right, to get started with your first project, the first thing we're going to go ahead and do is go to the project page. If you go to my website, learn.leekotner.com, you can find it courses at 225 down here, and then click on Project 1. It takes you to this page. And if you scroll down, you'll see project phases and grading. Anyway, if you click on phase 1, it jumps down to the first phase. This is what we're going to be talking about in this particular demonstration. And it talks to you about the stuff that you need to do for the assignment, which I've kind of already gone over, but I actually walk you through on creating a basic mobile first responsive design template to get started. And so if you want to download the starting template structure where it says HTML5 template structure, you click here, it'll download a zip folder called Project1. And then you can click on this link and it'll take you to the videos that you're watching now. So anyway, I'm going to walk you through how to get started. So go ahead and click on this to download your HTML5 template structure. And let's take a look. I've already done it. So I'm going to look in my htdocs. And what I did was I downloaded it straight to my htdocs folder. So I've got a zipped file called project1.zip. If I double click that on a Mac or on Windows, you right click and say extract all. So I've got my project1 folder right here, and let's take a look inside of there. Actually, let's just go right there. And right now what we've got is we've got a template.php file, and I already went ahead and gave you a reset file. We'll talk about that in a minute. So go ahead and open that template file, and you'll see that it's got a basic structure already set up. And I'm just opening mine up in Dreamweaver. That's what I'll be using for my editing tool, but you can use whatever you want. Komodo Edit, Sublime, brackets, whatever you wish. All right, so before we do anything else with this, I want you to remember, let's look at our structure here. This is a PHP file. So if you look at the file ending, it is in .php. Of course, that means that we have to have Apache service on our computer so that we can see what we're doing, unless you wanted to upload everything to the server directly, which is fine. But for those of you who are using your own web service on your computer, go ahead and make sure you've got that turned on. Let's see, I'm going to look up here, and I've got mine running right now. And so if you go to manage servers, and I'm on a Mac, yours might look a little bit different on Windows, but it's basically the same. And I've already talked about this before in a different demo. Go ahead and make sure Apache is running. So you want to select it, and you can just click on. You could do start all, but there's no need to run your MySQL database service or anything else because we're not using that yet, and it'll just slow your computer down a little bit if you don't have a fast computer. So I would just click on Apache and then hit start, make sure it's running, and then just minimize that. Okay, and so if you wanted to test it, you can then go to your web browser. Okay, I'm going to open a new tab, and I will type in the word localhost, and then I'm going to go to my project 1, and here's my template file, and this is what we've got so far. And I'm going to close this. And you see that it sort of has like a very basic structure. When I say basic structure, what I mean by that is you see it has some styling, but it's not styling that I've added. You'll see when we look at the template that there's no CSS attached to it right now. So it's getting it from somewhere, and that somewhere is the default browser style sheet. So as you probably have learned from your other classes, that the browser will apply a default set of browser styles unless you have actually overwritten them with other CSS. And the reason is so that it has some kind of hierarchy on the page when you go to look at it. And so this is what we have. It's just a bunch of basic stuff so that we have a structure that we can actually style. It's just a starting place with markup. So let's go back to our page and let's take a look at it. And you could go, if you're using Dreamweaver, you could also go into, showing your display view. You could go to design if you want, and you can kind of see what we just looked at in the browser itself. You can go to split view. I'm going to do a vertical split. Let's do it that way. Yeah, so if you want to do it that way, you can, but I tend to, just so you know, I tend to like looking at my just code view. And if I really want to see what it's doing, I'll usually look at it directly in the browser. Now, something, if you're used to using Dreamweaver, that you might be accustomed to is the preview and browser feature. That will sort of work when we're doing the template, but beyond that, it might not work after that. I would, just for the sake of making sure that everything is the way that you expect it to be, I always like to do browser refreshes. It's up to you though. So you can choose to use the design feature in Dreamweaver if you want. But some things don't always jive exactly whenever you're using PHP, because Dreamweaver, it doesn't have the capability of behaving like an actual web server. So looking at the structure, you'll notice that it has a set of markup that I have provided for you that's just a starting place. And I sort of refer to this as like a baseline set of information so that I can do baseline styling. One thing too that I want to show you, if you are not aware of it, is that like if you want your font for your code view to be a little bit bigger, like if you don't have the greatest vision or something, or if you just, your eyes get tired, you can always go up here to Dreamweaver and you can go to Preferences, find where it says Fonts right here, and where it says Code View, you can also change the font that you're using in Code View. I would recommend just leaving it alone, but if you really don't like the font that they use, then I would suggest, instead of just picking something that you think is pretty, make sure that you're picking a monospace font so that you can really see where the spaces are, because later in the semester, it'll really screw you up if you don't have your spaces right. So I'm going to bump this up, let's say maybe to a 14 point. Let's try that. And that might be too big for you, but I'm going to put it that big because I think that it's going to be probably more helpful for you guys when you're looking at it in this video. So one of the things that I want to first start off with is, you'll notice if I go back to my browser and let me do a refresh on the page. The first thing you'll notice is you'll see that this pops up and it's asking me if I want a translation. If you start noticing that that happens in some of your older web pages that you've designed, the reason it's happening is because now it is a requirement. It's not like an official requirement, but it is a requirement for validation that you include the language that the page is intended to be read in your HTML. And I left that out of the original template because I wanted to make a point of it. All right, and let's go back here, and this is something that only recently they started being a lot fussier about in browser enforcement. So if you go up and you find the HTML tag on line 2, you can put a space and you can put lang, and you see it prompts you, all right, and then you want to use English, so en. So that's what we're going to do. If we save this, I'm going to save it with a keyboard command, and then I go back here and I hit refresh. Look what it did. One of the things you might notice whenever you're using one of these kinds of Apache web services is that some browsers sometimes don't want to refresh things properly. And so I'm going to go ahead and tell you this right off the bat, and remember this all semester long. If you go ahead and hold down the shift key, say in Google, I'm using Chrome, right? And you hold down the shift key and then reload it, it will do what's referred to as a hard reload. Okay, it won't reset everything, but it'll reset everything for that page. It'll basically throw all of the historical information away. That's sort of what a soft refresh is supposed to do. This really forces it to empty its cache out. Let's go ahead and do that, and you see that the language prompt goes away for translation. So if you have any old websites that suddenly start doing that, it's not that anything has necessarily changed on the code end, it's that browsers are now starting to enforce this. If you're watching this at a later date, maybe this is old hat, but this is still pretty new at the time whenever we're doing the recording. So let's go back to Dreamweaver. And I'm just going to really quickly go over the basic structure. So of course we have some, the head. I'm going to just collapse everything, right? So that we've got the head and the body, obviously. Inside of the head, I'm just going to collapse or open that up so that we can look at bite-sized pieces at a time. Obviously, we have the title right now. It's just called template. We'll deal with that later. There's also a line that I've put in here that I didn't make you type, but we're going to talk about it. And it is a meta tag with the name of viewport and the content attribute of width equals device width, and also that it sets the initial scale to 1.0. So what is that doing? This is for responsive design. This is something you have to have in your HTML in order for like a mobile phone or a tablet or something to be able to automatically know the correct native width for the device, so that you can reset it so that it will look scaled and proportional on the phone or the tablet, as opposed to having a large desktop site, even if it's mobile and responsive, suddenly look like a tiny site with tiny text on a phone. Right? So there are some things that you might be confused about, like, when we talk about responsive design. Responsive design, you can have media queries and stuff, and it's still responsive. However, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily mobilely responsive if it's still hard to read on a mobile device. So this is the first line of defense that you would want to have in your HTML as opposed to just your CSS, right? So you need this in your HTML in order for mobile devices to properly view and scale content so that it's proportional to the actual device width. Okay, and then on line 9, I've got a comment, an HTML comment that says, Google font link goes here. We're going to talk about Google Fonts, and then you've also got your external style sheets prompt here. It's another comment, and this is where you're going to first start by using what's referred to as a reset. I'll go over that in just a moment. Let's quickly take another peek, though, at the rest of this page. You'll note that I'm really pretty adamant about putting comments in. You see that, so that I can easily and quickly identify different sections of the page. I'm going to always request that you do that. I'm going to suggest that you do it for everything in the future. It's just a good practice. It's really also especially good if you're in work groups, so that other people can work with you and easily understand how you've divided up the page and stuff. Okay, so the way that I've got this first part is I've got a section, and it is the ID of banner. That suggests that this is going to go at the top of the page as a banner. All right, and then you'll also see inside of that we've got a header with a page ID and a site ID. I've got the H1 as the full site ID, so that'd be like the website name or like the company name, for instance, and then the H2 here would be like the page identifier, so that you know what page you're on, like about us or contact or whatever. Right, so you could always identify where you are in your navigation. And then beneath the header, we've got a separate tag called nav. You should be familiar with HTML5 markup. This is semantic markup. I believe in semantic markup. It's important. If it's a navigational section, it should be called nav. It shouldn't be called div with a list in it. It should be called nav. All right. I've given it an ID of global nav, and that's going to be important later because we're going to use some JavaScript. I'll show you how to use JavaScript to target that so that we can make this thing collapsible. All right, and then we've got an unordered list inside of it because having navigational lists is the best way to do it, as opposed to having, discrete anchor tags or discrete paragraph tags, for instance. It is a best practice to put navigation into lists. Okay, and so I right now just have them going to, the same page. It's just got a placeholder for the link, and it's got page 1, page 2, and so on. Later, you'll rename these things. Okay, and then what I'll do is I'll just go ahead and I'll collapse that banner section. And then now we have these other sections, right? And lots of people do things a little bit differently in terms of, like, this section, it could be called div, but it is a section. So I'm calling it section, and the reason I have it organized this way is because I like to have major sections so that if I have multiple articles in them, I can do that. So here's an article. This section only has one article, but I could have put multiple articles in there should I have wanted to. Some people will put a section tag inside of an article, and that's totally acceptable. This is the logic that I'm using, though, for this template, and this is what I stick to. So I'm just explaining my logic behind it. So an article tag should, inside of it, as a best practice, always have a header inside of it. And inside of the header, it should have at least an H1 or an H2. Now, one of the things you might be asking, if you sort of have done this in the past, it used to be a practice that there was only supposed to be one H1 on a page. Now with HTML5, you can have multiple H1s on a page if you want. So either way is totally acceptable and correct. So it's up to you. If you really wanted to change this because it really bothers you, the idea of it really bothers you, you could go through and make these articles like H2s and H3s, because up here we have our main H1. It's kind of up to you, but the way that I've got it is that every article's header has an H1 and H2. So anyway, that's just the way it goes. So you'll see that there's like paragraph. We'll figure out how to style paragraphs. You've got an unordered list and an ordered list, because we're going to figure out how to style those. And you can look down here, you'll see that there's a block quote so that we can figure out how to style it. There's also a code tag, a pre-formatted text tag, so it's a pre-tag, or pretext I refer to it as sometimes. If you don't remember what this is or you haven't encountered it, pre-formatted text is where normally in HTML, the white space, like here, this white space in this return wouldn't matter where it's a hard return, or this tabs section wouldn't matter, right? But what does matter in pre-text is all of this white space is actually read and interpreted as characters by the browser. All right, so that's how you can kind of control stuff with pre. Now, one thing about pre is that it's not going to be responsive. It's going to take up the space that it takes up because that's the actual nature of the tag. Okay, and then you can look down here. We've got some other stuff. There's a definition list, right? There's an aside, so you can look at that. And then also we've got a footer down here that has a bunch of like little article sections that have links in them, okay? And you'll notice that these headers and these articles only have an H1, and that's okay. All right, and that's the structure of the page. So let's go back up here. Let's take a look at dealing with the style sheets before we even deal with the Google font stuff. Let's take a look really quickly. If we go back into our file structure, we can see that we have a file here that's called reset.css, and I'm going to just open this so that we can take a peek at it. And it's referred to as minified. If you ever see like .min, that it means that it's been minified, so it's had all of the additional white space removed for efficiency and speed of the browser reading it. For us, it's not efficient to read it like this, but for a browser to read it, this is a lot easier than having to parse all the different white spaces and tabs and things like that. So this is a minified version, but basically what this is doing is it's going through and it's telling things not to have margins, and it's stripping any browser's default styling off of it. Earlier when I showed you, it shows like your heading levels as bold, and it has greater margins on the top and bottom. Your lists are indented with bullets and or numbers, things like that. Your block quote is already inset. So there's some things that it automatically wants to do as styling, and we want to undo that so that we're not fighting all of those margin indents and padding and bullets and everything that we don't want it to have. We're not going to fight it and have to undo it ourselves. We can just go ahead and reset everything back to 0. So if I come back here, I want to connect my style sheet, and what I had called it was the reset styles. And so I'm going to say external style sheets go here, and I'm going to just write down below. We're going to go ahead and do a link. If you remember, link is going to be the kind of, we're not doing at import, for instance. We're going to do a link tag, and we're going to do the href, and you can either browse, or I already have it set up here. It already sees that it's there in the same folder, and so I'm going to go ahead and say reset, and then after that we need to tell it what the relationship of it is, and it should auto prompt with some different options. And what you're going to do is find where it says style sheet down at the bottom, or you can just type it, and you need to put the type, and it is text CSS, right? Those are the things that you need for this to actually work. It needs to understand that it's a CSS type, and that the relationship is that it's a style sheet, and it needs to know where to go find that style. So I'm going to hit save, and don't worry if it says that it can't, dynamically related files can't be discovered, blah, blah, blah. Don't worry about that. Just close that. That's because it's a PHP file. So let's go here and refresh this. And this is now what it looks like without any styling, basically. I mean, it has some styling still, the links, if I didn't want them to be blue and underlined, but I'll go ahead and leave that there. And if you wanted to look for other resets, there are other ones than the ones I provided. You can go and you can look up CSS reset files, and you can use whatever one you want. That's fine. The one I'm using is by a guy named Eric Meyer. Okay, so we're going to have now to go and actually style all of this based on our architecture that we've got in the HTML file, and that's exactly what we want, because we want to start from scratch, right? So move on to the next demo, and let's get started.